China and Japan aren't just rivals, they're sworn enemies. Even today, in peacetime, you see signs of it. Chinese tourists vandalizing Japanese shrines. Restaurants in Japan putting up signs that say no Chinese allowed. Surveys show nearly 90% on both sides view the other negatively. Hatred this deep didn't come from a single conflict. It comes from decades of destruction, humiliation and fear stacking on top of each other. And it didn't start with World War II. It began earlier when the balance of power in East Asia completely flipped. For centuries, China stood at the center of East Asia. Countries like Korea and Vietnam ruled themselves, but their kings needed recognition from China. That recognition meant legitimacy, trade access, and protection. Japan was never ruled by China, partly because of the sea between them. But Japanese elites still looked up to China as the most advanced civilization. They adopted Chinese writing, brought over Buddhism. They copied Chinese styles of government, architecture, and art. For centuries, China was the model Japan learned from. Then that order began to collapse. In the early 1800s, Western powers started forcing their way into China. The most important clash was with Britain in 1839 and 1856, in what became known as the Opium Wars. Despite Chinese bans, British merchants were selling opium inside China. The opium drug was ruining Chinese society, which was getting increasingly addicted to it. When the Chinese government tried to stop the trade, Britain responded with warships. China lost the war badly. As a result, it was forced to open ports like Guangzhou and Shanghai to foreign powers. It also had to give up territories like Hong Kong and Macau to be Western colonies. In Chinese cities, foreign officials inspected cargo, collected tariffs, and decided how much money China would receive from trade in its own ports. The Chinese emperor may still rule in name, but he no longer fully controlled the country's economy, which was very humiliating for the once great Asian superpower. Foreigners were also given special legal rights. In parts of Chinese cities, Chinese courts had no authority over them. Entire districts were run by foreign powers with their own police, courts, and flags. China had once set the rules for the region. Now it couldn't even control what happened inside its own cities. In China, this period became known as the century of humiliation, the time when the country was pushed around, carved up by the West, and forced to accept unequal treatment. Japan was watching all of this. By 1853, it realized something uncomfortable. The same thing could happen to it. That year, American warships sailed into Tokyo. They were large, modern, and armed with cannons Japan could not match. The Americans demanded that Japan open its ports to trade. Japan didn't want to, but it understood the choice. China had tried to resist and had been humiliated, so Japan, not wanting to share the same fate, agreed. That shock led to a decision that would reshape the country forever. Japanese leaders concluded that tradition alone wouldn't protect them. They must become strong so that no other country could push them around. That's why in 1868, Japan launched what became known as the Meiji Restoration. It dismantled its feudal system. It broke the power of the samurai class and centralized authority under the emperor. It built a modern army and navy, and it sent students overseas to learn Western science, engineering, and warfare. As Japan modernized, it also absorbed a brutal lesson from the West. The great powers like Britain, France, and Spain all had one thing in common. They had empires. To be powerful meant conquering and occupying territory. China had been powerful for centuries, but when the world changed in the 19th century, it didn't keep up and was left behind. Japan believed that it had adapted and modernized. That belief changed how Japan saw the rest of Asia. If China was now weak and Japan was strong, then the old order no longer made sense. Japan began to believe that power, not tradition, determined leadership in Asia. We will see the domino effect of this belief later on. By the 1890s, Japan wanted to start building its empire. The unfortunate place that it would start with was Korea. In 1894, Japanese troops seized Korea's royal palace before installing a government there loyal to Tokyo. The Korean king requested help from China as they didn't want to lose their influence in the Korean peninsula. What happened next stunned everyone. China, the superpower, lost its place at the top of East Asia. Japan's modern navy destroyed China's fleet. On land, Japanese troops won again and again against Chinese forces that barely stood a chance. The war lasted less than a year. China was utterly defeated. In 1895, it was forced to sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki. The terms were devastating. China was forced to surrender its influence over Korea, and Japan quickly turned it into a colony. China was also forced to pay massive indemnities that drained its treasury, and he had to give up other territories, including the island of Taiwan. Taiwan had been part of the Chinese Empire for centuries. Losing it meant more than losing land. It meant admitting that China could no longer defend its own coast. Japan took control of Taiwan and ruled it for the next 50 years. This was the moment Taiwan was separated from the Chinese mainland. For China, this was unbearable. Being defeated by Western powers had already been humiliating, but being defeated by Japan, a much smaller country that has spent centuries learning from China, was a new level of low. It shattered the old order. From that point on, Japan replaced China as the dominant power in East Asia. And this was only the beginning. What came next didn't just deepen the rivalry, it turned the rivalry into a deep trauma with scars that never healed. By the 1930s, Japan's rise had entered a new phase, but it had a problem. It had built a modern army and navy and an industrial economy to match, but it couldn't sustain them. Japan had little oil, limited iron and rubber, and not enough farmland to support its continued expansion. Its leaders had watched what happened to China when foreign powers controlled its trade and access to resources. They believed that Japan could not be dependent on anybody else for its strength. They found a solution to their problem in Manchuria, a region in northeastern China. Manchuria lay just beyond Korea, which Japan already controlled. It was vast and rich in coal, iron, farmland, and railways. Everything a modern army needed. So in 1931, it created an excuse to invade by staging an explosion that damaged one of its railways. It blamed China for the incident. Within months, Japan occupied Manchuria easily, overwhelming local resistance. China could not do anything about it because at the time, it was caught up in its own civil war. Japan learned something dangerous. It could take Chinese territory by force whenever it wanted. From there, everything escalated. By 1937, Japan launched a full invasion of China. Its leaders spoke of creating a new order in Asia. They argued that Western powers had humiliated and exploited the continent for generations, carving up China, forcing unequal treaties and dominating Asian trade. Japan claimed it would end that system. It presented itself as Asia's natural leader, the only Asian country strong enough to push out the West and restore order and dignity to the region. Japanese propaganda portrayed China as weak, divided, and incapable of governing itself. Japanese control was framed as guidance. Occupation was described as cooperation. But the reality that followed was a level of violence beyond anything the world had seen at the time. The most infamous episode took place in Nanjing, China's capital at the time. Over just a few weeks, in December 1937, the Japanese army killed more than 200,000 Chinese. Prisoners who had surrendered were executed. Women were sexually assaulted on a massive scale. Entire families were erased. The invaders no longer treated the Chinese as humans. Japanese soldiers boasted about their executions. Officers held contests to see who could kill more prisoners with a sword. This brutality did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of the mindset that had taken shape during Japan's rise in the last few decades. It taught its soldiers that strength justified everything and that those who could not defend themselves were inferior. In this world, mercy was weakness. The Japanese military's goal was no longer just to defeat China's armies. It was to break the country's will entirely. The violence did not stop at Nanjing. Japanese forces pushed deeper into China, burning villages, seizing all food and livestock, killing or starving entire populations. This brutal approach had a name: the Three Alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. Then there were also crimes carried out far from the battlefield. The Japanese army operated secret facilities dedicated to human experimentation. The most notorious was Unit 731. It deliberately infected Chinese prisoners with disease, froze them alive, exposed them to chemical weapons, killing thousands in what they called medical tests. Then, the Japanese army seized local women and forced them into brothels in Iran to provide comfort for its soldiers. By the time the war ended with America's bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the damage was staggering. In total, up to 20 million Chinese died in 8 years of war. Cities lay in ruins. Entire regions were scarred. But what happened after the war made everything worse. After Japan surrendered in 1945, a number of senior leaders were arrested and prosecuted in the Tokyo War Crimes trials. A small group was convicted and punished by hanging. Officers who had overseen forced labor and mass killings simply returned to civilian life. Unfortunately, as the world shifted into a new Cold War, priorities shifted. At this time, the Soviet Union was expanding its influence and the communists in China were taking control. Japan was no longer treated as a defeated enemy. It was now seen by the United States as a crucial ally in Asia, a partner against communism. What that means is that the US wanted Japan to rebuild quickly, and the quick way to do that was to rely on the officials and bureaucrats who ran Japan during the war. One of the clearest examples was Kishi Nobusuke, who became Prime Minister in 1957, and the more you read about him, the worse it gets. Like, wow, this guy got to become Prime Minister. During the war, Nobusuke helped run Japan's occupation of Manchuria. He authorized the mass use of forced Chinese labor, sending millions into brutal conditions in mines and factories where more than half died. According to his subordinates, he saw the Chinese as more like dogs than human beings and would only understand brute force. After the war, Nobusuke was arrested as a war criminal, but then he was released and returned to politics. After becoming Prime Minister in 1957, he founded one of Japan's most influential political families. You probably know his grandson, Shinzo Abe, the longest-serving Prime Minister in modern Japanese history. This was a huge slap in China's face. A man who had openly expressed contempt for Chinese lives and overseen slave labor on a massive scale was not only spared, but his political legacy lived on at the highest levels of Japanese power. Then there were many of those who ran the human experiments in Unit 731, like its director, Shiro Ishii. They were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for the data from the experiments, which the Americans believed could be useful in future biological warfare. For China, this was the greatest insult. The people who committed these crimes weren't punished. In fact, they were protected. From that point on, the wounds from this war could no longer be put to rest. That's why for China, even though the war has ended, it was never really fully resolved. To remember the great tragedy, the country built memorials across the country, the largest of which was the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall. Every September 18, the anniversary of Japan's invasion of Manchuria, air raid sirens sound in cities across China, keeping the wounds of the war fresh in people's minds. This memory shapes how China deals with Japan today. Whenever tensions rise with Japan, the anti-Japanese hatred is brought out. In 2012, Japan nationalized the Senkaku Islands, which are these islands in the East China Sea claimed by both countries. In response, in China, protests broke out in more than 100 cities. People smashed Japanese cars in the streets. They attacked Japanese embassies, factories, and restaurants. The government amplified the anger with images of Japan's wartime atrocities. The message from the government to the people was clear: Japan had not changed. In Chinese, there's a phrase to describe this feeling: 血海深仇, a sea of blood. Hatred so deep it drowns everything else. That's what shapes every dispute between them now. More recently, in November 2025, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi stated that an attack on Taiwan would be an existential crisis for Japan, which is basically saying that Japan will fight China over Taiwan. Afterwards, Chinese social media erupted, which portrayed her as a return of Japan's past militarism. The Chinese government discouraged its citizens from traveling to Japan, and so Chinese airlines have cancelled over 500,000 flight tickets to Japan, destroying its tourism industry and damaging its economy. For many Japanese, this might feel a little unfair. They feel that their country also suffered in World War II, especially after the bombings on its cities. It then had to rebuild itself as a pacifist state. Its people might think, why are they always held to account for a war that their generation did not fight in? Its leaders have also apologized repeatedly to China, but China sees those apologies as hypocritical and hollow. On many occasions, sitting Japanese ministers have stated that the Nanjing Massacre was a fabrication and questioned the accuracy of the death tolls. Even Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister from 2012 to 2020, said Japan needed to move past a culture of apologies. Textbooks in Japan often try to soften the language describing the events of the war. For example, instead of saying the Nanjing Massacre, they might say the Nanjing Incident, which is a more innocent term that strips away the scale and intent of the killings. To make things worse, Japanese leaders continue to visit shrines commemorating the country's fallen soldiers in World War II, like in Yasukuni Shrine, which honors, amongst many, those convicted of war crimes for leading the invasion of China. Japanese leaders defend these visits as remembering patriots who served their country, but for China, it's honoring the war crimes they committed, a proof that Japan has never fully broken with its militaristic past. Public opinion has shifted in Japan too. Recent polls show that nearly half of Japanese voters now support defending Taiwan if China attacks. Japan has increased its military spending. China sees this as history returning. From this dark era of history, both countries learn the same lesson. If you are weak, you get exploited. This is why the hatred hasn't faded. China and Japan are not just arguing over Taiwan or trade or some border disputes. They're looking at each other through memories shaped by war. A century of hatred does not end easily. It ends only when the past stops deciding the future. Right now, it still does in many ways. If you want to understand how Taiwan has become the next flashpoint between China and Japan, watch this video right here.